Hello, I'm Annabel McGilvray. I'm the Director of Communications with the AIIA, and here with me today is Geoff Raby, former Ambassador to China and economist. Thank you for joining us, Geoff.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Geoff has joined us directly from the state lunch marking the visit by Li Keqiang. It's nearly a decade, I think, since Li Keqiang...
09, yep.
09,
yeah.
so nearly a decade now, and there's been a lot of change and some ups and downs in the relationship. How robust is that relationship at the moment, and perhaps how significant is this visit?
Well, the relationship's underpinned by some big and important fundamentals, not least the trading relationship. And as Li Keqiang was quick to point out today, according to their figures, not ours, China runs a $50 billion trade deficit with Australia. By our figures or any others, we are the only developed country in the world to run a trade surplus with China. So the trade, the economic relationship, the investment flows, the students, tourism, all of that is a very substantial underpinning for the relationship. Where I think the relationship feels stresses and strains is that with China's inexorable growth, we struggle at times to adjust our position to the reality of China in the region and how so much else has changed as a result. And part of that problem we have is because we are in an odd situation, probably uniquely placed in the world, where we are more dependent than nearly any other country on the Chinese economy and on China, therefore. But our security comes from the United States. The US is the dominant power, and China is the ascendant power, and the US is under pressure to create strategic space for China. And we struggle to find how we position ourselves between the dominant power and the ascendant power.
Well, I'd like to come back to that, but perhaps your answer there sort of refers to the next question, which is perhaps in the past you've been critical of how the Australian government has managed this relationship. Perhaps how well is the Turnbull government managing the China-Australia relationship today?
Look, they've avoided any major hiccups, which is something. And maybe it's standing with faint praise. But the reality is that in Canberra today, what I'd call the idealist view that stresses values over pragmatism is the predominant way of thinking about China and the relationship. That's driven in part by views in the United States, not uniformly held in the United States, but in communities such as the defence intelligence communities, there's a strong view that we cannot have the same quality of relationship with China because we so-called don't share their values as we would with countries where we have similar values. To my mind, that leads you down all sorts of rabbit holes and dead ends. And we saw that when China proposed the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. It was a no-brainer that we would join. We did eventually join. We were invited to join as the founding developed country member, which would have given us enormous influence over the process, over the shaping of the bank. We could have got ourselves a deputy president position as a result. Instead, we dithered and struggled with this decision for a very long time, only to join the AIIB after Liechtenstein and before Norway, neither of whom you'd regard as serious players in the Asia-Pacific region.
Well, on that note, perhaps, of regional cooperation with regards to trade and finance, obviously this trip is very much trade-focused. I think there's a delegation of perhaps 200 business representatives included. So perhaps what changes, looking specifically at the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, what changes might we see there in the short term?
Well, I think the big one will be greater access for Australian beef producers, and particularly chilled beef. Frozen beef, no problem, but chilled beef has a much higher value in the market. But it's been restricted by a whole lot of regulatory issues. And China seems to be prepared to relax those regulatory issues now. The irony, of course, is at the lunch today, where beef was top subject between the leaders, they served chicken, which really isn't the way to promote our products. And Li Keqiang frankly, he referred to it 3 times in his speech. So we're not very good at selling ourselves sometimes. But seriously, I mean, that's an important development inside the free trade agreement. I'm sure when the announcements come out after the discussions, there'll be other tweaking of elements of the free trade agreement. It's worked well. It's given us tremendous access to the horticultural market, the wine market, and we had to do it. I mean, one reason why we had to do the FTA when we did it, and all credit to Andrew Robb for concluding it, is that we were being killed in the market by our competitors like New Zealand and Chile that already had FTAs. So it became a defensive agenda for us as much as an offensive one in terms of how much we get out of the trade.
Yeah. And so then looking perhaps at another aspect of that trade relationship, the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, where is that up to? And perhaps will it be the alternative to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that some have put forward?
Short answer is no. It's a different sort of agreement, if it ever reaches the stage of agreement. It's got a long way to go, and it's going to be, I think, fairly loose and messy, largely because it has ASEAN at its centre, even though China was a very active proponent of it. And it will be more about forms of cooperation rather than hard legally binding changes in regulatory regimes. The thing to understand about TPP is it was going beyond more conventional trade agreements. They had to, in order to get the US really engaged. And they've tried to address a whole lot of what we call behind-the-border regulatory measures. And it's quite ambitious and advanced. That's one reason why I never felt China would become part of it. It's at a level of liberalisation when it comes to these regulatory measures that is too far for China to go at this stage. Also, of course, China wouldn't want to join an agreement these days that had been begun by others and they were part of its formation. But RCEP is useful. It's useful to have a conversation going on around that, but it's not an alternative to TPP.
So finally, in an opinion piece in The Australian earlier this week, Li Keqiang alluded to the US administration with some pointed remarks about self-isolation and about trade wars not making trade fairer and protectionism not protecting. Where is that relationship? Obviously, that's the latest remarks that we can see, but the China-US relationship, where is that heading at this stage?
It's early days in the Trump administration, and I think the more we see the Trump administration, I think the more we understand that they don't really know where they're going. And there's a great deal of confusion and jockeying for influence and arguments over policy inside the administration. So it's too early to say. What I'd say, if you step back from the current issues, is that there's tremendous ballast in the US-China relationship. I've always been, even when I was ambassador, I used to report to Canberra that we ought not to get too excited by journalistic stories about coming clashes and conflicts between the US and China. It operates at so many levels and there's so much engagement that it would take a massive storm to knock it off course, and that's not going to happen. There'll be tensions, periodic and episodic tensions, but basically it's a very well-based relationship. And as for Trump and the way he develops China policy, again, it's something I've been saying for a long time. Just think of Boeing, Westinghouse, GE, Apple, and we can keep rolling off the names. These people know how to lobby in Washington.